Right, it is the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How Your Pandemic-Driven Innovations Can Strengthen Your Brand and Vice Versa. I'm Jarrell Jenkins, Local Art Services Coordinator with Americans for the Arts. We've got such a great program planned today, and I'm so excited to introduce our speaker, but first, some quick reminders. ArtsU is our e-learning platform offering a variety of training options to support your work in the field. You can visit us at artsu.americansforthearts.org to view upcoming events. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. However, you can feel free to pop those questions in the Q&A box at any time. There, you can also upvote questions. Questions with the most upvotes will be pushed to the top of the question queue. There are automated closed captions available for today's event. You can view these by selecting the CC button at the bottom of the screen and select Show Subtitle. Today's PowerPoint will be made available to you following the event. At that time, it will be added to the Resources tab on the event page. And please note that this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available in about 2 business days. You can use the link for today's webinar to access that recording. And so, with all of our housekeeping out of the way, let's go ahead and introduce our speaker. Roger Semets is the founder and CEO of Semets Blackstone Associates, a brand-focused strategy, content design, and web consultancy with a deep arts and culture practice. He works with clients to define, articulate, and implement branding and communication strategies to help them better navigate change, connect with and steward their constituencies, bolster both earned and contributed income, build skills and fluency of staff and boards, and advance organizational goals. We're so glad to have Roger with us for today's webinar, and we'll kick it off to him to get us started.
Great. Share my screen here and get the title slide up. Does everyone see the title slide?
Looks great.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time to join me for an hour, and hope you get something out of it. You already heard the sort of title. A lot of things have been happening in the last 18 months, and our take through our practice has been they can strengthen your brand, and your brand can strengthen the new things you are doing if you just sort of think about it that way, and that's what we're going to get into. So a little bit of an agenda, a couple slides on who's behind your screen, looking at the last 18 months of sort of process for strengthening your brand, and then a case study in progress. And it's, often we do case studies that are sort of cooked, but this one we're kind of in the middle of, and maybe that'll be, interesting because it's in process. Semets Blackstone headquarters is in Boston, that building with the glass roof. Unfortunately, there's nobody in it at the moment. We're all dispersed. What we do may be a little different from some firms you've worked with, in that we integrate all that stuff on the bottom of the slide you're looking at, from research through to training boards. And while we certainly make stuff, websites, brochures, whatever, we really get hired for our ability to sort of define and articulate clients' values and promise. And we're going to talk about that. And to translate that into bolstering earned and contributed income and creating authentic brands. Also important, we focus for decades on making sure that whatever we do, it becomes an asset for our client, for a performing arts organization or a museum. So you don't end up with just like a brochure or a website or something, but you end up with the thinking. As you heard, deep arts and culture practice, we have 5 of the top 10 orchestras in the country, a bunch of festivals, museums. This has been something that's been close to the office's heart, and certainly mine, since its inception, and an equally deep education practice. And the reason this slide is up here, like a ballet or a museum, nobody has to go to a college, nobody has to give them money. So creating resonance and connection is an issue for both arts and education. So we're going to dive in here and put on our way back hats, which is not all that far way back. 18 months ago, we had audiences, we put on plays and reviews. We had, we could put on operas. innovative dance stuff, orchestral performances, go to museums of different sorts, invite people in for community programmings of different kinds and stripes, and actually be upfront, close and personal with our donors. But that, of course, was then. And then 18 months ago, all that changed, as we all know. Our theaters were dark. Our museums, maybe, while they probably didn't take down the art, you get the idea. Things were sort of empty shells, whether it's the enrichment programs we were running, musicians were out of work. And this is how we talk to our donors. Very different than, passing around the rosé. The good news is that many of you pivoted, to use a word that we're probably all sick to death of, and innovated. And at the same time, your brand practically overnight became more important. And why was that? It drove decisions in your favor or not, like whether people were going to return tickets and donate them or ask their money back, whether they were going to support boards and management hard decisions, and whether, in fact, your brand was going to inform the new things that you were going to try. And people did try things. So a client of ours, Seattle Symphony, all of a sudden, like many of you, became a media company. They weren't really prepared to become a media company, but that's what had to happen. Organizations mounted digital-only content. And as you can see in some of these slides, the ones that did it in their brand more closely connected this new content with who they were or are. People made content definitely for people at home, and ways to watch, listen, and enjoy. It's the Public Theater in New York. And another client of ours, Provincetown Art Association and Museum, rather than mounting things digitally, invested in being able to take virtual tours. So you were in the space, you could walk around, you could steer yourself. For a small organization, this was a big leap. And then some other clients, this is also one of ours, Dallas Symphony, took the opportunity to sort of aggregate all that and become a resource. So you could listen to things, you could watch concerts and interviews, you could go back and look at, listen to old concerts or current ones and really be a resource. And of course, many people expanded their educational offerings. This is Mark Morris, more education online that people could really get into. This is a shot of the Boston Symphony Orchestra education program where, as you can see, the musicians are color-coded by section as part of that digital educational offering. And people, again, Dallas, they still wanted to connect to their community, so they found innovative ways to do that. So Dallas has a truck, as you can see, kind of a small ensemble, but bringing it to the people. And we got a closer look in many cases at musicians. So this is a BSO volunteer musician thing, presenting a concert for the city of Boston after their tour to China got canceled. And what came out of that was sort of breaking down the fourth wall, where you would have normally seen, in this case, orchestra musicians or opera singers, in costume or black tie. You got to see them in their basements with their dog running by and some toddler. And it made things more personal all of a sudden. Now, how that got branded more or less makes a difference. You can see there is the BSO mark in the corner there. And people got innovative about putting on, events. So they knew they couldn't get in front of people, but they wanted to do one notch better than rectangles on a Zoom screen. So this is Seattle Shakespeare. And then one of my favorite examples of pivoting was creating art or creating offerings only for digital. So not a concert film of a concert that was going on, but a completely new idea. So this is the Getty, obviously a big organization, but their initiative to ask people to interpret well-known pieces of art with stuff that they had at home because they were stuck at home. And I think it's brilliant. And it totally reinforces, the value of the Getty and their brand attributes. So in a year and a half, there was a lot of progress. So one client friend of mine who runs a top 10 orchestra said, we had more progress in 10 years, more progress in 1 year than we could have made in 10 years because of COVID. We beefed up technology, we hosted virtual participants globally, expanded our reach globally, developed new education discovery programs. We broke down that fourth wall between artists and audiences, and many organizations even raise more money. But what we really care about here is making sure that these innovations build your brand. They're informed by your brand. So, did you get credit if you did some of these things, or did they sort of spin off? Were they one-off tactical innovations, or did they really, prove the meaning that you wanted to have out there? So we need to sort of dig into brand. Think about that. So I'm sure because all of you have more than a passing acquaintance with brand, it's more than your logo or your logotype, as in these consumer brands here. So how we look at it in your space is, what do you promise? What's your history, your position, your values? What do you need? And that's expressed through your offerings for sure. The experiences that you offer people, either in person or virtually, how you communicate, which has become more important, and the impact that you can demonstrate. And these should all be informed by strategic thinking around what are your brand attributes? What's your architecture of offerings, messaging that you have out there, and how you present yourself visually. So these four things are sort of the main buckets that we're going to dive into. So how do we get to this stronger brand? Certainly a collaborative process, either working with a consultant, like us, or with a group within your organization. First step, getting calibrated, which is usually interviews, surveys, audits. We'll get into that in a little bit. Coming up with those brand attributes you want to be associated with, and those that you don't, really learning about your audiences and thinking about brand relationships. That's a really important part when you're launching new initiatives that either can or cannot be well connected to your organization. And then it sort of organically builds here. So with that data, you can start in on messaging. Some organizations need new names, develop your content. And again, that then feeds how you express yourself visually, so that visual decisions are not sort of pulled out of a hat. They're coming from attributes. They're coming from storylines. They're coming from your survey of the competition. And then you can develop whatever, because it's all based on this sort of shared understanding. And then lastly, as we said in sort of the second slide here, you want to make sure that you really own all this, so that you have documentation and training, so that everything isn't being invented from the ground up. And across all of this, we want to think about, or I'm sure many of you want to think about, lifting both marketing and development up at the same time. This is not just a marketing initiative. Good marketing is good fundraising, and vice versa. So starting in on that chart a little bit, having qualitative interviews, we like to do this in sort of concentric circles. Start with your, leadership and your board, move out to staff and team, out through community partners. And what you're doing is you're sort of taking in the vision from your leadership, and then you're sort of both listening and testing that vision, as well as more tactical questions as you move out your concentric circles, so that you're getting perspectives from different stakeholders within a framework. And, you can do this, obviously we used to do this, all in person in workshop sessions. We now do a lot of it this way. There's an advantage. People have names, you can call on them. That's kind of handy. But you do kind of miss the in-person bit. And you want to sort of dig into who the different constituencies are. So the people who care about education, the parents, teachers, students, what do they care about? What do they want from your organization? If you're selling tickets, what do those tickets care about? And what are the messages that need to get after those ticket buyers? if your importance in the civic landscape, or need to be more important in the civic landscape, what are those drivers? And then, of course, who's your donor community and what do they care about? What do you want them to think? What do you want them to do? So this lets you sort of, put together ultimately a brief of all this that you've learned. You also want to look at what you're actually doing. So we're going to look at Seattle Symphony in a little more depth a little further on, but this is before we started, in case anyone thought this was cool. So, you may think that Wolfgang thing is cool, but I think you could all agree that there's not a lot of glue here holding this together. If you saw one piece and then saw another piece, there's no Waldo. So now we're going to look at sort of attributes. Again, we're kind of moving a little bit quickly here, but this comes out of all those interviews. And we look at those in 3 columns. What do you own that you want to reinforce? So brand attributes are qualities that are associated with almost anything. Even if you're a person who likes just German cars, Audis and BMWs and Mercedes have different attributes. If you have a couple of laptops around you, there are different attributes associated to PCs than Macs. So what do you own? You want to reinforce. What do you aspire to own, which is really the driver in all of this? And then what do you want to manage away? So as that previous shot sort of hinted at, we're going to look at Lyric Opera of Chicago, another client. So they owned artistic excellence and cultural leader and emotionally moving in the grand scale of opera. What they didn't own, but needed to have associated with them, was being more accessible, being seen as entertainment and not something that was, stuffy and boring in 19th or 18th century. They need to be thought of as more innovative. They need to be thought of a place to be, and they need to be more welcoming to many people who have never gone to an opera. And they need to manage away things that are in common to operas and orchestras and many museums across the country. It's boring, it's elitist, it's not for me, I can't afford it, whatever. So it's important to sort of make this list. And this is something you can definitely do, with a team within your organization. Because if you pin this up on your real or virtual bulletin board and you agree on this, it'll inform how you write, how you design, what kind of social media posts you get out there, even what you present. Because you can't ever say we're not something. You have to just prove what you want to be. So that aspirational column is really important. So we talked briefly in that chart about brand strategy, and we're going to dive in there. The goal here is to really craft relationships that work with you. And in pivoting and coming up with some of these innovations, organizations have come up with sort of one-off things that might be valuable, but the value doesn't accrue to the organization. So this is a 4-slide course in brand strategies. So on the left, product branding, you see all this candy and stuff that you would get at the airport newsstand if you went to an airport newsstand. And they're all made by Mars, but you may not know that, or in any case, you're not expected to care about it. So there's no shared value proposition. So any nonprofit or arts organization that mounted their education effort like Twixt, and their community programming as M&Ms, and their onstage something as Skittles, no one's ever going to get the heft of your organization. So moving to the next strategy, which is called endorsed, because that Nabisco triangle is kind of endorsing those Chips Ahoy cookies, is still product branding. There's no visual system, there's no real shared value proposition, but it's kind of telling you that the Nabisco chocolate chip cookies are worth more than the Stop and Shop ones, whether or not you like them better. Anyway, that's the intent. So there's a teeny bit of glue there, not much. And a lot of arts organizations do go out this way. And our take is that it's not enough. The third thing, source branding, which could be a label we invented a couple of decades ago. You can sort of see what's happening. The funny name, Milano's or Bordeaux, is brought forward in parallel with Pepperidge Farm. So it's more than that corner. And as you can easily see, there's a visual system, and this is extendable. So we're not showing stuffing and bread and goldfish here, but you all know that they look similar to this. So what happens is, if someone tries one thing, they'll try another. You'd never go into a store and say, let's get Nabisco cookies for a meeting. You would go into a store and say, let's get Pepperidge Farm cookies for a meeting, whenever you had meetings that had cookies. So there's cross-selling built in here, and time saving because it's a system. And then lastly, master branding using Entenmann, staying with butter and sugar, flour. It's just categories: cake, strudel, Danish. So you lose the proprietary names like Milano's or whatever, but everything accrues to the master brand. So something between source and master is generally right for most organizations. So again, we're going to look at lyric opera when we started. So here's a program on the left. There's a piece of website on the right. There's really no strategic thinking here. They're just sort of there. But then when you get deeper, they had this really interesting program, Chicago Voices across the city, not branded as lyric. So it was really successful and they got almost zero credit. Or they had this unlimited brand where they put all the operas written in English or written by a Black composer from Chicago. And again, it was sort of by definition thought of as sort of second tier if it was even associated at all, because it was separated. And then they did a musical at the end of the year, largely to raise money, but came up with this Broadway lyric brand. Well, there was already a Chicago Broadway brand, the same way there's a Broadway brand in almost all cities. So it didn't connect. And because they were doing a top-notch job of putting these on more than a rented roadshow, it was really to their standards, but they didn't, again, get credit. And then they just said some silly things, my name, to one side, that just undercut the professionalism of the organization. So brand strategy, naming, how they're connected is really important. So we ended up in a master branding strategy, sort of see here at the top left of the website, that informed everything. Excuse the glass of water. So what's the goal here? I mean, you can see the downside, but the goal is what we're calling creating virtuous circles. So if you have an offering that's cool or innovation, you want that equity, that goodness, that success to accrue to your organization. So it gets stronger and you can launch more innovations or offerings or make them stronger, support them better, raise more money, which in turn strengthens the organization. You get the idea. But if they're not branded in a way that's connected, none of that happens. Okay, we're going to move on to message development. We're first going to talk about sort of brand storylines, maybe not something that's in your vocabulary at the moment, and a messaging framework. So if the y-axis here is that which you stand for and the x is what your constituents care about, will participate and support, not surprisingly, you'd like to start messaging at that highest level of intersection because you're more likely to have connection and resonance and people are going to find it relevant. So we developed storylines for lyric, sort of on the entertainment side, amazes, replenishes, inspires, engages, talk about innovating and invest. You can connect these right back to the attributes we looked at a few slides back. They advancing artistic excellence, the whole idea that opera, is the only place where voice and orchestral music and dance, acting, theater, and stagecraft come together. They needed to be thought of as more welcoming, so that's the storyline. And they needed to be understood that they were actually using the tools of opera in their work across the greater communities of Chicago, and that they were in fact training the next generation of artists. So you get the idea. So these are concepts that you want to have in your different constituents' heads. Now, any one of them doesn't have to be differentiating, but in the aggregate, they should be you. So then we start to apply those. So it's what we call a messaging framework. So the top line, red bars, are different audiences. So those aren't actually messages. Then you have your elevator message in this sort of orangey big bar. And then what we call tilted messages, because the notion is that a single ticket buyer is not the same as a long-term subscriber, is not the same as a community partner. So again, in workshops, however, whether they're real or online, digging into what do these different constituents really care about, so that you can build a main message. So obviously we're skipping a few steps here, but getting to the lyric high-level message, you can see how it kind of rolls up the storylines and the attributes. So amazes, replenishes, inspires, engages audiences. Well, what do they do that with? With must-see, must-hear live experiences. How do they do that? Through the timeless power of voice, acting that brings characters to life in triumph and tragedy, the splendor of a great orchestra and chorus, theater, dance design, magical stagecraft. And then what's the benefit? Audiences emerge, thinking and feeling differently when the curtain comes down because they've been immersed in these worlds, both familiar and unexpected. So then we sort of move on. Again, a donor's not the same as a single ticket buyer who's maybe never been to an opera. So we work again thinking about how that might play out. So meeting specifically at this point with donors and development staff and coming up with what we call ways in for donors. So I'm sure you can apply this to wherever you are. You can extrapolate. So some people, talking about opera here, care about the sustainable future. Some people care about artistic excellence. Some people care about the grand canon, the 17th and 18th, 19th century work. Some really care about getting new composers, on the stage. Some care about being an educational resource, and some care about training artists, and some care about diversity. And the answer is because you're not monolithic and your constituents aren't homogeneous, the answer is okay. So to the extent that you can come up with a menu of ways in for donors, you stand a much better chance of meeting people where they are, and that the innovations that you're doing will probably, fall into one of these ways in, and they can both support innovations or the innovations are a way in. So looking at how some of this messaging that we've been looking at for lyrics starts to get applied, here's a very different subscription piece that we did that embodies the edginess and innovation that they needed to be better known for and not looking like stuffy costume dramas. But once you go inside, you can see how some of that messaging that we kind of breeze through, the replenished, inspired, must see, and the smaller type up on the right, bringing together the power of voice. So it's not just here's an offering, here's an offering, here's an offering. We are always selling from the top down and the bottom up. So if you think of programs as bottom up and your sort of brand narrative as top down, we always try to make these come together. And we came up with a new architecture for development materials, again, based on all the stuff we've just looked at. So this is the entry-level friends piece. You can see the must-see, must-hear bit. Training the next generation. It's a friends level, so it's entry level. As you move to the sort of patron and sort of the next level up, it's more about, your partners, you're part of the family, shared enterprise, forging the future of opera. So it moves more toward investment. And then as you move to the next level up, which is benefactor, it's all about investing. So it's philanthropy is not like giving money so you get a better parking space. Valued collaborating, critical investment to bring opera to life. And what you get out of that, is essentially moving the organization, forward in the different ways that are important to you, and then sort of, showing the impact right through to the website. So this consistent set of attributes to storylines to messaging, is informing everything. Nothing's one-off. So the chunk we haven't looked at is, okay, how does this look visually? So what's important for all arts organizations, or almost all arts organizations, you have this common challenge of needing to look fresh seasonally, but wanting to build brand equity across years. Similarly, you need to look appropriate. Social media is not the same thing as a website or a sign. So you need to use media in the best way possible, but they all need to reinforce the same image. So we look at this systemically. You're kind of getting the ideas that we're sort of systems guys here. So you have your primary identifier, which could be a symbol, or you call it a logo or a word mark, but how you use type, color, imagery, gesture, and composition is equally important. Both the choices you make and how those are articulated. So we're going to dive in here. So this is a before mark, so nobody say that's cool. This is kind of a down and out European art museum in a not good part outside of Boston. And we helped transform them into what's now a top-notch craft museum. So the mark is all about touching the art. It's all about not having, velvet ropes. Celebrity Series, we actually did this mark years ago, a preeminent presenter. But new executive direction was going to be more about world music. It was going to be more about energy. It was going to be more about being inclusive. So that's the story that this mark can tell. And actually, we were able to raise money for a presenting organization, which is generally a tough thing to do. Before and after of Sydney Symphony, perfectly acceptable baton swoosh. The mark we did, is it about the audience? Is it about the repertoire? Is it about enthusiasm? You can tell a lot of stories for it. Unfortunately, they have recently scrapped it, but no, I'm not bitter or twisted, don't get me wrong. And then just showing one in process. So this is also before. Newport Music Festival had a real problem competing with, I'm sure the better known ones, the folk festival and the jazz festival. And there's kind of hackneyed piano sailboat thing. And you really couldn't tell what they did. So we changed the name to Newport Classical so that it was clearly not folk or jazz. And why I included this for you is that, they had three different kinds of areas of focus. They had a festival, they had chamber series, and they had community concerts. So the mark kind of morphs around a little bit. You see how the circles change and the colors change, but they're clearly getting credit for these different areas of endeavor. And the chamber concerts were an innovation that came out of COVID times, and they wanted to make sure they got credit. So you see how this starts to come together. But to look into the system, that ball chart we just looked at, we're going to look at Seattle Symphony. So you saw one slide earlier on about sort of disparate, where's Waldo visual expression, where there are a fair number of slides like this. They just had people making stuff that they thought was cool, but they weren't trying to advance the institution or ensure that the institution got credit. They even had a website for the symphony and a website for their presenting side of the house, so that those things never intersected. But they did have a mark, so you don't always need a new mark. This was the mark that we started with. We did make it positive and negative, but all they had was that really crazy and pretty intense hot pink in the top left here. So we built out a palette that would support that and could be used consistently, and also how that palette gets used. So top left, more energetic, bottom right, calmer, so that when you're trying to evoke something, or if you're, planned giving isn't the same thing as some kid's event. So you need that flexibility in your system, or someone's going to complain, oh, it doesn't work for me, and go rogue. So you have to build in that flexibility. There are three typefaces. Together they advance the attributes that need to be advanced. The Adobe Garmin is in there to give some gravitas to the classical side of the house. And again, it's how it gets used. So you can see how bold it is and overlaid. So it's not just the typefaces, it's how they're articulated. And then we talked to them about photography. I mean, everybody likes to take pictures of their events, but if you think about it in a few different categories, like who's making the art, who's taking the art in, where's the art happening, then you can start to think about how you could tell a story. And then within that, you can think about, okay, we can take, photographs where someone's in focus and the background's blown out of focus. We can take wide shots, we can take close shots, but think about it as content and then execution. Or, this particular stuff that you need for family concerts or school programs. They also wanted, they understood that, but they said, can we have something like, extra that no one else has? So we came up with this level of sort of abstract textural photography that's all about sort of movement and energy and tying in with what the city of Seattle means, and ways of sort of layering things. You see how this starts to come together in the first subscription and this tagline, first subscription piece. I mean, this was made with bunches of plastic hung on the stage and wrinkled. I won't say it's the most sophisticated image, but it definitely separates them out from, you know, what they would think of as stodgier orchestras. Another season, we photographed smoke, again, to keep that movement and that other sort of ethereal level going. And then for third season, we had introduced a new music director. You can see how that's sort of working with the type, you know, right through to this bold approach to type and layers for school programs, or very different kind of invitations for development events, right through to a pretty innovative website, right through to the current one. You can see how the color scheme keeps going, and you can see how that evocative photography is now the cover art for their burgeoning set of recordings that have come out of the pandemic. So you can see how they all relate. They're a series. I mean, not that anyone's, you know, working their fingers through record bins anymore, but just seeing them anywhere, it builds equity in the organization. And then this is all documented, and we had training sessions, so again, they could sort of own it. And then one last example here before we get into our case, I think. I wanted to make sure you didn't think that only big organizations could do this sort of thing. So this is music festival in Idaho, only happens for a month. Have this great shed they don't own. But you can start to see how the gestures, the textures, the making sure that nature is, you know, one of the main elements, starts to create a very distinctive and inexpensive to produce graphic system. This folder that's up on the left is probably my favorite because it shows the most innovation. And then, you know, galas always need to have something special. So how the system gets tilted, you know, for a gala, right through to the website. Okay, so now we're going to do a sort of quick case study and process. New Jersey Symphony, really their job was to build understanding and engagement, support and value for an organization that really was very innovative, but wasn't getting that credit. If you just look at challenges on the bottom of the screen, you know, kind of unfocused brand awareness. They were in 7 venues, which makes it really tough. And they didn't own any of them. Really tough to have, you know, a loyal local constituency. And of course, they were between the Philadelphia Orchestra and the New York Philharmonic, which is a tough place to be. But they had a lot of signature innovations. They were making concert films, which was a lot more than putting a camera at the end of the center aisle. They had on staff this artistic catalyst, which was really furthering DEI goals more than anyone else was doing. They had commissioned a large work just for the pandemic, just for digital. And they were really ahead of the curve in their DEI programming, but none of this was either known or sufficiently connected. So, you know, we had our interviews, as we talked about. We saw where they were. This is a page from their website about all the different venues. And they had really disparate brand offerings. So just look at that top row. I mean, it's really hard to tell the difference, what the difference is between virtual and at home and on demand. And I realize people have been using these words for the last 18 months, but they're still confusing. And then they had a youth orchestra at the bottom right, branded completely differently. And then visually, well, you can decide that for yourself. But another, so the on the left here is a capital campaign. On the right is an annual fund, education flyers in the middle. And you can see how through brand thinking or lack of brand thinking and lack of visual system and lack of any brand narrative, these are not connected. So there's no heft, there's no like, where's New Jersey Symphony Orchestra? And then they use a lot of different kinds of images. I put these together, but if your organization looks like this, well, I'm sorry. So we started to look at their identity and name. You can see from the subscription piece on the right, every time they used New Jersey Symphony Orchestra with their mark, they had to repeat it because it was always too small to read. Their messaging was sort of clever, but you know, conducting business is not really a reason to go see a concert. So all this came together in a brief. We audited the big guys, spent a lot of time in the New York Philharmonic and Philadelphia, what they were doing, and then made a lot of recommendations around positioning and name. This is about 90 pages, so it's not really all that brief. And then we put together what we learned. So as you already took in a couple slides back, what they own, what they aspired to own in terms of attributes, what they needed to manage away. Now this didn't click. We actually got rid of the word orchestra because the thinking was that symphony and orchestra kind of meant the same thing, and we needed to make it shorter. So we looked at different ways that might be expressed. These are sort of 3 finalists. You'll see where we landed. And then going back to our chat on brand architecture, again, is virtual home and couch concert, what's the difference here? So this all got put together under a sort of new brand heading of virtual, although we kept concert films because that was a big deal. And then all their community stuff, they had been using everywhere elsewhere. You can see it in the top left. New Jersey Symphony everywhere was everything, not on the stage. So it made it a lot easier to understand. Worked on a positioning statement where they could win. They were more innovative than the big guys. We turned the 4th, 5th bullet here. The whole idea, they kept saying they were statewide, but really the advantage of statewide is that we could bring the music to individuals. The symphony comes to me. And they've been talking to themselves as a service organization, which denigrated the artistic excellence. So we turned that around. So we developed these sort of high-level storylines, your orchestra, statewide presence, and supporting storylines. I don't want to go through all of these because we don't have any time for questions. And then developed a top-line message, that it's redefining what it means to be a nationally leading relevant orchestra, essential to the rich cultural fabric of our state, inspiring, enriching, entertaining experiences across genres and venues, and then importantly, bringing music that's meaningful to you. And then thinking about that messaging framework, it's slightly different for a first-time attendee where it's all about, unforgettable date night, thrilling sound of orchestral music, exploring cool venues, and that it's yours, take some pride in it. Or the donor take, they take pride in the nationally leading relevant orchestra. They care about that it's, training the next generation of performers and listeners, and that it's essential. And then, of course, donors, we can't do it without you donors. So these are sort of 2 examples of tilted messaging. And then we sort of get into the visual expression. So this was the winner of the format of the new word mark. You can see it's in these 3 colors. And like what we looked at for Newport Classical, it's built so that it can be a system so that things can attach to it and not have their own marks. There's a core blue palette with a corresponding sort of accent palette. And then how photography is dealt with, it's both, actual literal color, a high contrast black and white, and color fields. And then a very dynamic approach to type that shifts and slides and has a lot of weights, so that you're not talking about being dynamic, you're not talking about being innovative, you're actually being it. And then a set of angles. And then these are sort of the prototypes that came out of that we're now in the middle of. So you see how virtual that whole sub-brand is attached there. Concert films, a bit noir, this big composition that they commissioned and performed, obviously in everybody's basement. They're everywhere in Ocean, that they're actually in hospital rooms. And then we took their website, which is the existing website, and because they didn't have a lot of money to spend, showed how the typographic system, the mark, the colors could make it a lot more cooler in many senses of the word and not require a big investment. So that was critical. So you need to be able to bring it into line, but websites are expensive. So to the extent that you can bring your brand assets in successfully, that helps everybody. Through to new subscription material, inside they face the problem that many organizations face of, images from different management firms. So how do you make that feel like it's all on the brand, right through to social media? And a pretty cool email header, which when we did testing, the email header got actually the most votes, which is kind of interesting because it's an email header. So that's New Jersey. So it's kind of the end of our tour. And what I want to leave with you guys, a couple of summary slides, your brand, outsized influence on decisions, ideally informing innovations and benefiting from it. But it needs to be managed, built with intent. It doesn't just happen. Again, it's not that just your logo, it's your promise, what you mean, history, position, values. It's expressed through, your offerings, experiences, how you communicate the impact that you can prove, and that in turn informed by strategic thinking about the things we've just been talking about: attributes, architecture, storylines, and messaging, and visual expression. So it's hard to sort of summarize success, but it's really all about, building that brand and then living it, so that your content, what you produce, how you communicate, it's all consistent. It all sort of proves those attributes and storylines. We talked a bit about brand strategies, trying to get those virtuous circles going to make sure you get credit, save time and money, and make sure things get connected to your organization. And then if you're dispersed, our office is still dispersed, make sure that your teams have the tools and thinking to deliver communications that reinforce, even though people are in different states, being dispersed should not equal disparate output. So you're evolving. Innovation aligned with your brand will help you to continue that upward trajectory. And then there are 4 worksheets here. I know this is going to get put online so you can get them. The brand attribute 3-column slide that you can sort of think about in groups or however that makes sense for you to work it, because it is important. How you start to think about ways in for different constituencies, whether it's donors or your education community. What are you trying to get out there, and what do they care about, and where's that intersection set? The sort of filled in messaging framework, but you could fill in, okay, we have these kind of audiences and these kind of audiences. They need this kind of storyline and that kind of storyline. So again, it's sort of a template to start work on. And then lastly, thinking about your visual system as more than just your identifier or a color. It's type, color, imagery, gesture, and composition. And beyond that, it's how you use those things. So there we are. And I can stop sharing and we can see if there are any questions. If I have any voice left.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. We don't have any questions right now in the Q&A box, so feel free to type those in. And we'll jump in with Q&A with questions that I have for you, Roger, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So first things first, I think you had talked about logos and talking about the transition of different logos and the improvement of different logos. A scenario, let's say that your supervisor believes that there's this logo and the logo is the brand. How does one convince her that you need more than a logo for a brand?
Well, I mean, we showed that on some of those slides. I mean, the Seattle examples, I mean, you can put logos on things and still they don't cohere, or go back to the example of the Nabisco cookies. There's a Nabisco logo on all those things, but it's totally disparate. You never recognize it. You'd never, you would never cross-sell yourself from one to the other, and the organization doesn't really get credit. I mean, nobody really cares about Nabisco. You care about Lorna Doones, you care about Chips Ahoy, but you're not going to care about the organization. So the reason the rest of these components and approaches are necessary is so that you gain sort of heft of the organization. You create a stronger sort of, magnetic field. And that gives you, ideally, the money and the stature to really better fulfill your mission.
Absolutely. Thank you. And one of my favorite parts in your presentation was when you were talking about color palettes and color schemes and all that stuff. You mentioned about building in flexibility. So you had that chart of all the different ways that the color palette could be built. I was wondering, what your advice is there a possibility to be too flexible when you're building out a chart like that? And how does one select or settle on and select just like the key group of color palettes for their branding?
Well, sure. If you're too wide, then you really don't have a palette at all. So that Seattle one was pretty wide. We've certainly built ones that have like 6. So yeah, there's something between, flexibility and chaos. So you're right about that. How you get to it, it comes back to that chart we showed at the beginning, which is, learning about, who you are. I mean, what are the attributes you want to reinforce when the attributes you aspire to be? If you want to be thought of as innovative and technologically cool, you probably don't want brown to be your main color. So yes, it's kind of a soft science, but colors do evoke different levels of energy and different levels of meaning. And in combination, they certainly do. So, you want to make things as objective as possible and proceed in your visual thinking from your storylines and your attributes and say, okay, is this going to help us get there?
Absolutely. And that kind of takes to my next question around this same topic. So when folks are kind of building these color palettes or these kind of physical representations of their brand, they're building that at the beginning by starting with their messaging, their story, their purpose.
Right.
Who should be at the table, in your opinion?
Well, that's a good question. So we showed you concentric circles when we were talking about interviewing people. We take the same sort of concentric circle approach to managing a project on the client side. So you want, 1 or 2 people to be your day-to-day, project team, because you can't move something along with 20 people. But you want to conceive a next ring in your concentric circle out of who are the people you need to present to. So in other words, you might have, director of communications and somebody from development as part of your core team. Your next present to team could be, executive director, a representative trio of board members, a couple of attendees, whatever. The next rung out might be community partners. So, you got to manage it with a pretty tight thing. You'll never get it done. But you have to keep bringing everybody else along. So think of those concentric circles. And as you get further out, conceivably they have less say. You're more informing than asking. But you are bringing them along. The last thing you want to have happen is this happens in the marketing office in the corner and you throw it over the wall when it's done. And half the people are going to hate it just because they didn't have anything to do with it.
Agreed. Or, audiences may feel as though that brand doesn't represent them.
Right. No, but you want audience members in your interview sessions right from the beginning, and probably one of those concentric circles.
Absolutely. Thank you.
No surprises.
Absolutely. So we do have a question in the Q&A box. The question is, do you think brand personas are too commercial for nonprofits? That's the first part of the question. Second part is, how would you approach persona exploration for a nonprofit?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a commercial word, but no, I don't think it's too commercial. If you think of personas as different people in your wide constituent group, and personas are how do you, talk about them, so, an urban millennial who has never, we'll just stay with a concert for a second. Urban millennial has never been to a concert and didn't have music education. I'm building a persona here, is different than somebody, I'll take an extreme example, who came here, from Germany and had violin lessons from age 4. These are very different people. Or someone is, a civic leader who cares that, doesn't really care if she goes to a concert, but she cares that the city needs a good orchestra because that attracts people and that's good for business. So you certainly can build these personas. And then, when you're thinking about different ways in for them, we only did that donor one. You can think about, okay, what do they care about? What do you want them to do? And we use these especially in building websites, because, a millennial mom looking for something to do with her kids on a Sunday afternoon, that's a different journey on a website than somebody who's researching, what if 6 times that you've done Dvorak's New World? Admittedly, that's kind of an obscure case. But in any case, people are coming to your website as different people looking for different things. Or an education partner is different than the mom looking for something to do on a Sunday, is different than someone who wants to, book a subscription for 6 concerts and know what they're going to be doing on Thursday nights. So we absolutely build these personas, and then we test them. We build sitemaps, and we actually find those people and see if they can get what they're looking for. It's really fun, actually, but it also takes it out of the realm of sort of hocus pocus.
Right.
Always a good thing.
Right. We do have a few more minutes. Another question has entered the chat box. We want to do an audit of our landscape as we look toward a rebrand. How would you structure a brand audit?
So I can't tell from your question whether you did say landscape, so I'm assuming you mean outside your organization.
I believe so.
We do internal ones and external ones, and I think it's important to do both. But for the landscape one, first you have to you can't do 20 organizations. So, pick 5, 6, 7 that you're competing with for, mind share, attendance, donor, stature, whatever. And then, we've put together a template for that. Like, okay, what's their mission? What's their high level message? Maybe they don't even have one. What are their offerings? How are they organized? What kind of brand strategy are they doing? What's buzzworthy? What are they doing on social media? How are they using, so we go down, we essentially audit all the stuff that we've just talked about in the last hour. And what there'll be things that you learn that you can say, oh, that was a good idea. Like we just did a series of orchestras for a client, and only one of them was doing sound sampling as a way to sort of break down intimidation and give people, so people didn't feel stupid when they walked into the hall, because they just had this sound sampling and it had a little blurb with it. So we thought, okay, they're competition, but that's a good idea. So you learn stuff, and you also see where you can win. Like if they really own a piece of a pie, and you want that piece of the pie, it would be harder for you to own it if they do. So where you can fit it. So, you basically come up with a template of, the 10, 15 things you want to look at, and you do it for all those 5 or 6 organizations. And then you can look both vertically down that organization, and you look for it, and then you can sort of write a summary across and say, okay, here's what's happening in our landscape. Nobody is doing this. And, we could, if we did a little more of something, we would clearly be the winner here. Hope that helps.
Yes, thank you so much. And we do have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to fit this question here as our last question. Let's say there are some small organizations in the participants today, or will be watching this later, and they're the only marketing and communication person on their team. What are some advice or insights from you on how they can make headway, how they can make moves to get them started along in this process?
Sure, and we've certainly confronted that. They're often too small for us to work with, but we, give them pointers. Things like, working on your attributes and storylines. You probably need a couple collaborators. They don't have to be in the communications function. They can be your executive director. They can be a board member, whatever. You can certainly work on that by your, in a small group internally. And if you're using outside design help, that work will then give you direction to give them, so that an outside designer isn't building something that satisfies his or her ego. Like, I really want to do this cool thing. It's like, okay, are those decisions, reinforcing the attributes we want to be known for? Are they, elevating this really important storyline, like we're the only whatever in town that does whatever? So to the extent that you can build up some of the foundational stuff, it then provides direction and objectifies, as opposed to subjective, working with other people. So, you may not get everywhere, but you will at least feel like you're engaged in a rational process to move things forward that moves way beyond I like it, I don't like it. And if you've done that, it also helps, if someone comes into the room and says, okay, I just started this new educational thing, I'd like it to be orange. You have a better chance of saying why. Prove it.
Absolutely.
So that's important.
Yeah. I think I spoke too soon. There was a question that just popped in the chat box right before I asked my question. So this will be the last question, okay? So our director wants to do a new logo for every season because they don't want people to get bored. How do I convince them to stick with the brand?
Well, you might lie on your back and kick your feet and scream. But maybe you don't want to do that. Okay, so we talked about the challenge that most arts organizations have of being seasonally fresh and building equity. The whole notion of doing a logo every season essentially means you're throwing away all your equity. Like, it's bad enough the organizations that keep their logo and every year looks completely different because they're throwing away a lot of equity that way. At least the logo is there. If you change the logo, you have no equity, and worse, aside from looking like you don't know what you're doing, it looks like you can't make decisions or whatever. It looks like chaos. So it would look unstable. People would never get a sense of who you are. So it'd be a lot harder to get any kind of loyal participants or donors. And it costs a lot of time and money to do it. So it's got everything going against it. So short answer is don't.
Well, thank you for sharing those facts. It's absolutely true. Well, thank you so much, Roger. That closes our time out for today. And thank you everyone that attended today's event. A reminder that this event was recorded and will be available for replay in about 2 business days. In the meantime, you can visit us at artsu.americansforthearts.org for other training opportunities and resources. Thanks.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.
Of course. Bye.
Bye.